The stage was set under the blinding lights of a national debate. It's a kind where every word feels like it echoes through the veins of an entire country. Cameras swept across the audience, their faces tense with anticipation, waiting for a clash they could already sense was about to erupt. Then, in one sharp moment, the silence broke not with reason, not with dignity, but with venom. The antagonist leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with arrogance. "People like you," he sneered, eyes narrowing at his opponent, "don't really belong here. You're standing on a stage built by Americans, and yet you act like you've earned the right to be one of us." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some clutched their chests, others shook their heads in disbelief. The moderators froze, unsure whether to intervene. A camera zoomed in on the hero, catching the flicker of pain that crossed their face, wound deeper than words, one that struck at ancestry, identity. Belonging, in that instant, the room divided. Supporters of the villain erupted in scattered applause, emboldened by his brazen attack. But the rest sat in stunned silence, as if the very air had been sucked out of the building. Viewers at home gripped their phones, typing furiously, hashtags already forming in their minds. It wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. The hero did not speak right away. They stood there, letting the weight of the moment settle, letting the cameras capture every heartbeat of their restraint. The audience waited. Would they fire back with anger? Would they crumble under the pressure? The villain smirked, mistaking silence for weakness, feeding off the tension like a predator circling its prey. But something was shifting. The crowd, once frozen in disbelief, leaned forward in their seats. They weren't just watching a debate anymore. They were witnessing a test of dignity, of strength, of belonging. And though the hero's lips had yet to part, their eyes told a different story. A storm was gathering, and when it broke, it would not be easily contained. The room was silent again, holding its breath. Everyone knew the insult was just the spark, but that was only the beginning. The insult hung in the air like smoke after an explosion, refusing to dissipate. It was more than a personal jab, it was a public challenge to the very idea of who gets to call themselves American. And that was the heart of the clash. This wasn't just one politician mocking another. This was a man standing before millions and declaring that citizenship, sacrifice, and service meant less than the accident of birth. For the immigrant watching from a crowded living room, for the child of first-generation parents sitting cross-legged on the floor, the words cut deep. They weren't abstract. They weren't just debate night theater. They were the echoes of playground taunts, workplace discrimination, airport interrogations, all condensed into a single, televised sneer. And that sting reverberated across the country America. After all, had always wrestled with this question. Is it a nation defined by bloodlines and borders, or by values and contributions? On that night, under those lights, the question became impossible to ignore. The villain wanted to drag the conversation backward, to a narrow, exclusionary definition of belonging. But the stakes had never been higher, because the audience knew what history had taught. That arrogance thrives only until dignity finds its voice. The hero's silence, in those first moments, was not weakness, it was a choice. They were letting the weight of the insult reveal itself, letting viewers feel the ugliness for what it truly was. That pause gave millions at home time to reflect, to feel the insult burn not just against one candidate, but against anyone who had ever been told they were less American for the way they looked, prayed, or spoke. Social media was already buzzing. Clips of the insult replayed in real time. Commentators began typing frantically, some defending, others outraged. Hashtags like #WeBelong and #NotYours began trending within minutes. The clash had broken the seal. This was no longer about political points. It was about the story America tells itself in its most vulnerable moments. And that's why the stakes were so high. Because dignity versus arrogance isn't just a debate stage rivalry, it's the battle that defines generations. Arrogance mocks, belittles, and excludes. Dignity stands taller, demands recognition, and reminds the world that worth is not granted by gatekeepers. The audience could feel it building, The inevitable moment when dignity would answer back, not in the same tone of anger, but with a force far greater truth. Still, the villain looked confident. He smirked, gestured with dismissive hands, as if he had already won. To him, it was just another applause line for his base. To him, the insult was strategy. But what he failed to see was how deeply his words had already backfired. Because when arrogance strikes that openly, it creates a vacuum. A hunger for justice so strong it cannot be contained. And in that hunger lay the hero's advantage. They had endured worse before. They had carried the weight of exclusion, the sting of doubt, and turned it into fuel. Tonight would be no different. The audience didn't yet know how the tables would turn, but they could sense it. Like the first rumble before a storm, the atmosphere was charged with expectation. Everyone was waiting for the answer, an answer that would come not with shouting, but with clarity so sharp it could not be ignored. What unfolded next would rewrite the conversation nationwide. Long before that insult echoed through the debate hall, the antagonist had been crafting his persona. He was the self-proclaimed truth-teller, the unfiltered disruptor, the man who sneered at political correctness as if dignity itself were an enemy. For years, he'd built his brand not on ideas, but on outrage, mocking opponents, belittling the vulnerable, turning every stage into a circus where cruelty was the main attraction to his followers. This performance was a kind of twisted entertainment. They cheered when he cut people off mid-sentence, when he barked nicknames instead of arguments, when he dismissed decades of service with a single sneer. Finally, they said, someone willing to say what we're all thinking. But what they overlooked was that arrogance, when left unchecked, doesn't just expose others, it exposes itself. His contradictions had always been glaring, though he counted on the noise to distract from them. He claimed to be a champion of the working class, yet his wealth was inherited, not earned. He railed against immigrants, yet his own businesses had profited from their labor. He styled himself a defender of American values, yet his behavior embodied the very opposite: entitlement without service, privilege without humility. The irony was almost cinematic, and it wasn't the first time his words had sparked outrage. There had been countless moments when he crossed the line, mocking the accent of a foreign-born journalist, deriding the faith of an opponent, belittling women with the kind of smirk he wore again on that debate stage. Each time, his defenders insisted he was just telling it like it is. Each time, the rest of the country winced, wondering how much further the bar for decency could be lowered. Yet pride has a way of convincing men they are untouchable. The antagonist believed his string of insults had made him stronger, that they had carved him into a political juggernaut. He mistook fear for respect, mistook attention for admiration, and in doing so he blinded himself to the truth. Arrogance may dominate the room for a moment, but it cannot hold the room forever. The crowd that night saw it too. Some leaned back, rolling their eyes as if they'd witnessed this show before. Others narrowed their gaze, fed up with the recycled cruelty masquerading as boldness. He thought he was writing history with his insult. In reality, he was replaying the oldest story of all the downfall of men who mistake their volume for vision. Hypocrisy clung to him like a second skin. He railed against elites while living in gilded luxury. He painted himself as a patriot while dodging responsibilities others bore without complaint. He cast himself as the champion of real Americans, yet divided them by race, creed, and birthplace. Each contradiction was a crack in the foundation of his persona, a fissure waiting for pressure to split it wide open, and that pressure was already building. Every insult added weight, every sneer tightened the coil. Viewers at home were beginning to see the pattern. The arrogance wasn't strengthened, was insecurity dressed up as dominance. The louder he shouted, the more obvious the hollowness became. The foreshadowing was unmistakable. History had seen this before. Leaders who believed they could bully their way into permanence, only to discover that arrogance is its own undoing. Pride doesn't just precede the fall, accelerates it. And as the antagonist smirked that night, basking in the fleeting satisfaction of his cruelty, the fall was already being written in real time. Because arrogance creates blind spots. It makes men underestimate those they attack, miscalculate the resolve of those they try to diminish, and And on that stage, under the glare of the cameras, the antagonist was too intoxicated by his own performance to notice the quiet strength rising across from him. He thought he had landed the final blow. He thought his insult would rattle, weaken, diminish. What he failed to grasp was that the silence in response was not surrender, it was strategy. But the villain had underestimated one thing. Before the lights of the debate stage and the roar of a divided nation, the hero's story began in far humbler places. Born not into wealth or privilege, but into sacrifice and struggle. Their earliest memories were of watching parents work hours that stretched long past exhaustion simply to keep food on the table. Their family's life was one of quiet dignity. No shortcuts, no inherited empire, no gilded safety net to fall back on. Just perseverance, grit. Just faith in the idea that in America, hard work and principle could carve a future. It was this upbringing that forged their character. As a child, they translated forms for parents at government offices, stepped in as a bridge between two worlds, one rooted in tradition, the other demanding assimilation. They learned early that identity could be weaponized, that an accent could invite ridicule, that a last name could trigger suspicion. But instead of bowing under the weight of these burdens, the hero turned them into fuel. Each slight became motivation. Each setback became proof that resilience would one day matter more than privilege. Through adolescence, their sacrifices multiplied. While classmates enjoyed carefree summers, the hero worked shifts, saved for tuition, and studied by the dim light of a library lamp. Their dream wasn't self-enrichment alone, it was service. They had seen their community dismissed, overlooked, unheard, and vowed that their own voice would not only speak but amplify the voices of others. To walk into spaces where people like them had to often been excluded, and to prove that belonging could not be denied by those who clung to power. The journey was never linear. There were defeats, lost elections, public smears, moments where doubters insisted they were too different, too foreign, or not ready. Yet each blow, rather than deterring them, sharpened their resolve. They learned to hold their composure in storms, to face insults without flinching, to absorb the cruelty of arrogance and respond with a deeper, steadier kind of strength. Where others shouted, they chose calm. Where others demeaned, they chose dignity. It became their signatures, an unshakable poise that no sneer could undo. In time, that poise became a mirror in which the nation saw itself reflected. Immigrants, children of immigrants, and anyone who had ever been told they were less than found in the hero. Not just a politician, but a symbol. They weren't merely a candidate on a stage. They were the embodiment of every sacrifice that had built America silently, brick by brick, without ever demanding recognition. And it was that authenticity, that lived truth, that made the hero uniquely dangerous to those who thrived on division. Because unlike the antagonist, the hero's strength did not rest on spectacle. It came from memory, the memory of their mother's calloused hands, their father's weary smile, their community's struggles and triumphs. It came from battles fought in classrooms, in workplaces, in neighborhoods where being underestimated was the default condition. They knew the sting of exclusion, yes, but they also knew the power of endurance. That was the difference. That was the quiet armor they carried into every fight by the time they stepped onto that debate stage. Hero was no stranger to insult. They had endured whispers about their name, their faith, their origins. They had heard laughter at their expense, attempts to reduce their story to a caricature. And yet through it all, they never bent. If anything, each insult reaffirmed why they were there, to stand not just for themselves, but for every unseen hand that had lifted America without ever receiving thanks. And so, when the antagonist's words sliced through the hall, words dripping with the arrogance of entitlement, the hero did not crumble. They remembered too much. They remembered too many nights of struggle, too many faces who had placed their hope in them, too many times when silence in the face of insult had been survival, not surrender. On this night, however, silence would not be survival. It would be strategy. What set the hero apart was not merely their endurance, but their ability to transform pain into narrative, insult into inspiration. They knew how to turn an attack into a moment that belonged not to the aggressor, but to the aggressor. Millions watching who saw themselves reflected in the clash. They knew how to take the arrogance of one man and frame it as the arrogance of an errand, then dismantle it piece by piece. Calmly, surgically, undeniably, that is why the stakes felt different now. The antagonist believed the insult would break their opponent, but the truth was far more dangerous. The hero had been prepared for this exact moment by a lifetime of being doubted, dismissed, and diminished. Every hardship had led here. Every sacrifice had forged the composure now radiating from them under the blinding lights. And though they stood silently, though the cameras caught only the calm exterior, within them burned a fire that had been stoked for decades. A fire of belonging, of resilience, of unshakable pride. A fire that would soon turn the villain's arrogance into rubble. The audience could not yet see it. The antagonist could not yet sense it. But history was about to pivot on that silence, and soon that strength would be tested like never before. The debate stage had shifted from theater to battleground. The insult still lingered, but now the air was alive with tension, humming like a wire-pulled taut. The moderator's voice cracked slightly as they tried to steer the conversation back to policy. But it was too late. The clash had taken on a life of its own. The audience wasn't waiting for talking points. They were waiting for the storm to break. The antagonist sensed the spotlight and leaned into it, convinced he was in control. He jabbed his finger across the stage, his voice rising with each word. "You don't understand what it means to be one of us. You can't possibly represent real Americans. You're a fraud." Hiding behind a smile, his gestures were sharp, almost frantic, as though volume and aggression could erase the unease beginning to creep into his tone. The camera panned across the crowd. Some supporters cheered loudly, but even among them nervous glances darted back and forth. Others sat rigid, their discomfort unspoken but visible in crossed arms and furrowed brows. The nation was split-screened. On one side, arrogance doubled down. On the other, millions of viewers leaned forward, holding their breath, waiting to see if dignity would hold its ground. The hero did not flinch. Their body language remained composed, hands clasped lightly at the podium, eyes steady. When the antagonist barked, another insult, mocking their upbringing, their accent, their claim to belong, the hero simply tilted their head, a small, quiet motion that spoke louder than words. It was the posture of someone unshaken, someone who knew the value of patience in a fight where arrogance always reveals itself. The escalation grew. The antagonist began interrupting the moderator, speaking over the hero, raising his voice until it nearly cracked. "Answer me this. How dare you stand here and act like you've built what men before you sacrificed for?" His face flushed red, his gestures wild. The camera cut close. His smirk had stiffened, his jaw clenched, sweat beginning to glisten at his temple. What had begun as confidence now looked like desperation masquerading as dominance. The audience in the hall reacted in waves. Gasps followed his cruelest lines, then pockets of applause, then stretches of uncomfortable silence. The moderators exchanged uncertain glances, their hands twitching over notes but unwilling to step into the storm. Social media lit up against clips of his tirade were being clipped, captioned, and dissected in real time. The words he thought would cement his dominance were already sowing doubts among viewers watching with unease. Through it all, the hero's silence became its own weapon. The more the antagonist shouted, the more the contrast sharpened, arrogance flailing against the immovable wall of composure. It wasn't just what the hero was saying, it was what they weren't saying. The power and restraint, the refusal to be dragged down into the mud. The cameras captured it perfectly, two figures side by side. One unraveling under his own fury, the other standing calm, grounded, steady as stone. And then the smallest of moments tipped the balance. The hero raised their eyes, locking gaze with the antagonist as he launched yet another insult. The look was not anger, not even defiance, it was pity. A calm, steady recognition that arrogance had already overplayed its hand. The crowd murmured. Viewers at home felt it. The tables were turning, though no words had yet been spoken. The pacing quickened. The antagonist talked faster, as if racing against an invisible clock. Each insult louder than the last, each claim more desperate. He mocked, he shouted, he sneered, but the more he thrashed, the more fragile he appeared. He thought he was cornering his opponent, but the reality was written all over his face. He was cornering himself, and still. The hero remained poised, silent, composed. Waiting, then came the counterattack that no one saw coming. For long minutes, the stage had belonged to the antagonists, fury his red face, his flailing hands, his voice cracking with strain. But then, at last, the silence broke. The hero leaned forward ever so slightly, and with a calm that cut sharper than any insult, they began to speak. "You know," the hero said, their voice low and steady, "what you just said tells us more about you than it does about me." The words landed like a pin dropping in a cathedral. The room stilled, the audience straining to catch every syllable. The villain shifted, forcing a smirk, but his eyes betrayed unease. The hero didn't rush. They paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the insult hang in the air like a weapon about to be disarmed. "I stand here," the hero continued, "not because I was handed this stage, but because I earned it. Because my family sacrificed for it. Because I worked for it. You talk about building America as though it belongs to you alone. But let me remind you, this country was built by hands that look like mine, by names that sound like mine, by people who were told they didn't belong and proved that they always did." Gasps, then applause. The first ripple of validation coursed through the hall. The hero's calm voice contrasted so starkly with the antagonist's rants that each word carried the weight of a hammer striking stone. The antagonist tried to interject, but the hero lifted a hand ever so slightly, an elegant gesture that silenced him without a word. "You say I don't understand what it means to be American. Let me ask you, what does it mean then? Is it a birth certificate? A bank account? Or is it the willingness to give, to serve, to fight for the promise of this nation even when it doesn't always fight for you?" The crowd erupted. Cheers, applause, a few people rising to their feet. The moderators glanced at each other, wide-eyed. This was no longer a debate. It was a reckoning. And let's be honest, the hero added, their tone sharpening just slightly if belonging in America were measured by sacrifice. "Then families like mine have paid more than you will ever know. My father worked shifts until his hands cracked open. My mother carried burdens without complaint. And I stand here because they believed this country could be better for me, for you, for everyone. That's what America is. Not exclusion, not arrogance, but sacrifice, hope, and the courage to keep building." The audience roared. Hashtags lit up instantly. Hashtag, "This is America." Hashtag, "We belong." Hashtag, "Mic drop moment." The antagonist's smirk faltered. He reached for his water, his hand trembling slightly, his face tightening as cameras zoomed in. For the first time all night, the confidence seemed to drain from him, replaced by something closer to panic. But the hero wasn't finished. They leaned in further, their voice calm but cutting. "You call me a fraud? But what fraud looks like is standing on a stage built by the sacrifices of others while pretending you built it yourself. What fraud looks like is mocking the very people whose sweat has fed your wealth. You don't own America. You borrow it from those who came before you, and you owe it to those who will come after." The hall shook with applause. People stood, some clapping, others shouting in affirmation. Even those who had sat silent earlier now joined in, swept up in the tidal wave of emotion. The contrast was undeniable, arrogance unraveling on one podium, dignity radiating from the other. The antagonist tried again, his voice cracking. That's not true," but the hero pressed on, voice rising just enough to command the space. "You can keep shouting. You can keep sneering. But America doesn't belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to the truest one. And tonight the truth is simple. Your insults say more about your fear than my belonging. You fear the future because it looks like me. And you're right, it does." The audience exploded. Cheers, chants, people stamping their feet as though history itself was being made in that room. The moderators tried to regain order, but it was no use. The hero had seized the moment, and nothing could stop it now. The antagonist's face was flushed, his eyes darting, his lips pressed into a tight line. His hands gripped the podium like it might steady him. But the cameras were merciless, capturing every flicker of unraveling composure. The more he tried to interrupt, the smaller he looked. The smirk was gone. The swagger was gone. What remained was a man exposed, pride deflated by truth, arrogance eclipsed by dignity, and then came the closing blow. Delivered not with rage, but with clarity so sharp it cut the air. "This stage," the hero said, their voice resonant, "is not yours to decide who belongs and who doesn't. It belongs to the people. It belongs to everyone who believes in the promise of this country. And whether you accept it or not, I am America. We are America. And we're not going anywhere." The room erupted into chaos, our chants, the thunder of applause. Cameras captured the antagonist slumping slightly, the hero standing tall. Online, the clip was already being cut, shared, captioned with fire emojis, GIFs, and stunned commentary. Within minutes, the phrase, "I am America," trended across every platform. Plastered on screens and echoing across households, it was a mic drop without the "Why Traps a Takedown" delivered through truth.com and undeniable conviction. The hero didn't slam the podium. They didn't raise their voice beyond what was needed. They simply let dignity do what arrogance never could, silence the room and ignite the crowd. And while the audience roared, the antagonist's face told the story better than any words. The fall had begun. The unraveling was undeniable, but the aftermath was bigger than anyone imagined. The debate had ended, but the night was only beginning. Within minutes, the internet caught fire. Clips of the hero's takedown flooded timelines, each one captioned with variations of the same stunned declaration. "This is the moment." Hashtags rose like rockets. Hashtag I am America. Hashtag mic drop. Hashtag we belong. Memes multiplied at light speed. One showed the villain frozen mid-stammer with bold text reading, "System error. Dignity not found." Another paired the hero's poised expression with the caption, "This is what leadership looks like." On TikTok, the sound of the hero's voice calm, steady, devastating became the new background audio for thousands of clips. People stitched their own videos onto it, immigrants telling their family stories, workers sharing footage of calloused hands, students showing off graduation caps decorated with flags and slogans. Each one ended with the same refrain, "We are America." Late-night hosts wasted no time. One replayed the villain's flustered face in slow motion, the audience howling with laughter as the clip looped again and again. Another compared the moment to watching a schoolyard bully get out-argued by the kid who actually did the homework. Monologues became victory laps, each joke drawing more attention to the raw humiliation of the antagonist. Cable news, meanwhile, split down familiar lines. One network's panel praised the hero's composure, calling it a masterclass in restraint and truth-telling. Another tried to spin the story, insisting the antagonist had been taken out of context only to be met with laughter on social media when side-by-side clips disproved the claim. But what elevated the clash from viral moment to cultural flashpoint was the chorus of voices chiming in from every corner. Celebrities tweeted lines from the hero's speech as though they were song lyrics. Athletes held up their jerseys in locker room interviews and declared, "This is America." A best-selling author called it the speech of a generation. Even a former president posted a clip, adding simply, "That's leadership." Politicians scrambled to react. Some praised the hero as the embodiment of American resilience. Others tiptoed around the subject, clearly rattled by the tidal wave of public sentiment, and a few tried to dismiss the whole thing only to face backlash from constituents who had watched the viral clip and felt something stirred deep in their chest. Everywhere, ordinary people were talking. In coffee shops, in classrooms, in group chats. Teachers replayed the clip for students as an example of courage under fire. Families watched it around dinner tables, grandparents nodding as grandchildren explained why it mattered so much. The phrase, "I am America," appeared on handmade signs, bumper stickers, and hastily printed T-shirts. For the villain, the fallout was brutal. Late-night hosts roasted him mercilessly. Columnists dissected his arrogance, his hypocrisy, his collapse under pressure. His supporters tried to rally, but their memes felt forced, their defenses hollow. The visual of him rattled and sweating next to a calm, composed opponent was too powerful, too undeniable. Pride had turned to parody. And yet, amid all the laughter and celebration, something deeper was happening. For countless viewers, immigrants, workers, dreamers, the hero's words had pierced a wound they rarely admitted was there. To be told night after night, in headline after headline, that they didn't belong, they weren't enough, that they were outsiders in their own home. And then suddenly, on the biggest stage, someone had spoken back. With dignity, with truth, with the kind of certainty that made it impossible to ignore. The clash became more than a debate moment. It became a mirror of the nation's soul, forcing people to ask what America really meant and who truly had the right to claim it. Was it birthright or belief? Arrogance or sacrifice? Division or dignity? As the headlines multiplied, as the hashtags soared, as the villain's reputation cracked under the weight of his own hubris, one truth was undeniable. The story was no longer just about two figures on a stage. It had spilled out into the culture, to the bloodstream of the country itself. Yet beneath the noise, a deeper lesson was emerging. When the noise of the debate and the frenzy of social media began to settle, one voice still carried above the rest, the voice of the hero. What lingered wasn't just the takedown, the memes, or the stunned silence of the villain. It was the message itself, distilled into a simple, unshakable truth. Dignity always outlasts hate. The hero's closing words were replayed across networks, etched into memory not for their sharpness, but for their clarity. They didn't lash out in anger. They didn't descend into the mud. Instead, they lifted the moment higher, turning an insult into a mirror that reflected back the best of who people wanted to be. We belong not because someone grants us permission, the hero had said, their voice unwavering, but because belonging is built by sacrifice, service, and love of country. And on those grounds, we are unshakable. It was a truth so clean, so undeniable, that even critics paused. The villain's arrogance had shrunk under its weight, while the audience inside that debate hall and far beyond sat taller, prouder, as if the words had unlocked something they had carried silently all their lives. For immigrants, it was validation long overdue, that their stories mattered, that their struggles counted, that their fingerprints were woven into the very fabric of the nation. For allies, it was a reminder that America's promise had always been greatest when it welcomed, not when it excluded. And for young people, it was a spark of inspiration, proof that truth could still cut through noise, that courage could still change the narrative. The moment began to be described in larger terms. Commentators called it the moral climax of the debate. Historians on morning panels noted that lines like these sometimes survive decades. Quoted in classrooms long after the cameras have turned off. In cafes and lecture halls, people whispered the words to one another like a shared secret. A reminder that justice doesn't always arrive with thunder, it sometimes comes through quiet conviction. Delivered by someone who refuses to bend. What made it powerful wasn't just what the hero said, it was how they said it calmly, without bitterness. With a kind of steady strength that made the villain look small, not just in that moment, but in the larger sweep of history. Arrogance had crumbled under the weight of dignity, and the crowd knew instinctively which side would endure. The applause that followed wasn't just noise. It was a release. People clapped not only for the hero, but for themselves, for their parents, for their grandparents, for every sacrifice that had ever been doubted or diminished. It was vindication wrapped in thunder, chorus of belonging echoing through the hall. Justice had triumphed, not because the villain was humiliated, but because the truth had been spoken without fear. And in that triumph lay the heart of the story, that no insult, no sneer, no gatekeeper could define who belongs in America. Belonging is earned through love, sacrifice, the courage to stand tall when it matters most. The hero hadn't just won a debate. They had given people a language for their pride, a reason to believe that their voices, too, mattered. that their presence wasn't conditional, but essential. And this is why their words will echo far beyond that stage. What began as an insult on a debate stage became something far greater, a reminder that America's strength has never been arrogance, but dignity. The villain may have tried to reduce belonging to ancestry, to paperwork, to exclusion, but the hero turned that attack into a universal truth. America is built by those who believe in it, who sacrifice for it, who embody its promise every single day. This is the heart of our story, the message pulsing through every replay, every hashtag, every conversation sparked in living rooms and classrooms across the country. It's not just about one moment. It's about a movement and insistence that justice is stronger than hate, that pride is stronger than prejudice, and that the American dream belongs to all who carry it forward. And that's why this video matters. Because the story doesn't end on that stage, it lives on in you. In every immigrant who refuses to be silenced, in every ally who speaks up, in every young person who looks at the hero's calm defiance and says, "That's the kind of courage I want to have." So here's the call. Don't let this moment fade into just another viral clip. Be part of the echo. Share this story with friends, family, and anyone who's ever questioned whether they belong. Add your voice to the chorus that says, loud and clear, "We are America." And if you believe in this fight, if you believe in dignity over hate, in truth over arrogance, join us here. Subscribe, stay connected, and help us tell the stories that remind the world who we are. Because the struggle continues, and together, we'll make sure the right voices are never drowned out. The movement is already here. Now, it's your turn to carry it forward.